everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm going to combine two of my favorite things in the world, books and opera. Now, you do not have to be an opera fan to love the books that I am recommending, nor do you have to necessarily agree with me that these books perfectly match the operas. These are quite simply books that I feel like match either the time period or the vibe of particular operas that I enjoy, and I thought I would share them with all of you. You may come away with a few book recommendations, you may come away with a few opera recommendations, but I hope you come away with something at least. So if you enjoy the opera Carmen by Georges Bizet, I would recommend the book The Barefoot Queen by Ildefonso Falcones. This is a book about the Romani or Gypsy community in Seville in the 1700s and everything that they went through under the Spanish government and societally, and flamenco music plays a big part in this novel. It's a family saga. There are star-crossed lovers, there are false imprisonments and arrests, and families torn apart. It is the most beautiful and one of the most compelling books that I have read in a long time. And my reason for connecting this with Carmen is that it will give you a lot of really great background into the Gypsy community and Gypsy life, and flamenco music and Spanish history, into the race relations in southern Spain and the religious conflicts between those two groups, such that then if you go back and watch Carmen after having read this, I feel like you will get a very different view of all of the characters and what they are going through. The next opera I wanted to talk about is Samson et Dalila by Camille Saint-Saëns. It is a dramatization in operatic form of the story of Samson and Delilah. And Samson and Delilah in the Bible itself only gets about 27 verses, in which we get very little detail about these characters. So what Saint-Saëns did in the opera is to flesh out their love story a little bit more and explore why Delilah decides to betray Samson, how she might feel about that, how did they meet, how did they know one another, as well as hearing a little bit of the Philistines' perspective as well in terms of why they want to destroy Samson. And you get to explore Samson's emotions, particularly his grief after certain things happen, which I won't spoil for you if you're not familiar with the story. But since that opera gives more life and more depth to biblical characters, I thought a perfect choice to go along with it would be The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, which follows Jacob's 4 wives, as well as his daughter Dinah, and all of her experience. And I loved this book because it really highlights what life would have been like for women in that period. We so often only hear from the male perspective, and this gives these women a voice, just like the opera gives Samson and Delilah a voice. The next opera I wanted to talk about is La Fille du Régiment, or The Daughter of the Regiment, by Gaetano Donizetti, which is about a young girl, Marie, who is an orphan and is discovered by and adopted by an entire regiment of officers. And they all look at themselves as her father, and she grows up being quite unfeminine for the time. Because she has been raised to fit in with all of these men, and she can hold her own. But then one day she falls in love with a man from the enemy camp, as it were, and hilarity and comedy ensue as these two try and work things out together. So to go along with that opera, my pick is Bloody Jack by L.A. Meyer, which is an entire series that I think really encompasses Marie's journey. This book is about Mary Faber, who is an orphan growing up on the streets of Regency London, who decides that she's had enough of this life and she wants something better for herself. So she disguises herself as the boy Jackie and gets herself a job as a cabin boy on a naval ship, and has to learn to fit in with all of these other boys and men on this ship. But she also soon starts to fall in love with one of her fellow cabin boys. And how on earth are they going to deal with this and keep her identity a secret? I thought this fits so perfectly. They are both uplifting and wonderful explorations of gender roles, and just quite a lot of fun. The next opera I wanted to discuss is Manon by Jules Massenet, about the young girl Manon who is on her way to a convent. She's being sent there by her family because she's far too high-spirited and outspoken and they cannot control her. But at an inn, she meets the young poet Des Grieux, and they run away together. And it is the story of this ill-fated match over the years, because not only does she love him, but she is also drawn to a life of wealth and glamour that he can't necessarily offer her. So to go along with this opera, I have chosen a book that I haven't actually read yet. So if the parallels don't entirely work out, please forgive me. But that book is The Thornbirds by Colleen McCulloch, which takes place in Australia, I believe, and is the story of Maggie Cleary and Ralph de Bricassart, who are star-crossed lovers, especially since he is a priest. And this was quite scandalous at the time. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. And I have to admit my only parallel is the fact that it involves a love affair with a priest. And if you've seen Manon, you will know why that is significant in the opera as well. Manon was also based on a novel itself called Manon Lescaut by Abbé Prévost, which I hope to get my hands on at some point. Of course, no opera video is complete without mentioning The Ring Cycle by Richard Wagner, who was a terrible person, but quite a brilliant composer. The Ring Cycle follows the Germanic gods of Wotan and Frigga and the Valkyries, including the independent and feisty Brunhilde, and all of the adventures that unfold after Wotan tricks the Rhine maidens out of some of their gold to forge a ring that will help him control the world. And 4 operas later, we chart the path of all of his decisions and the effects they have on the other gods and mortals, and ultimately what Brunhilde must do to save the world. So to go along with these operas, I would recommend 2 things. Either The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, another epic about a ring that was created with good intentions, but that goes horribly wrong, and the fate of the entire world rests on one person. In addition, much of the Ring Cycle is based on Germanic and Norse gods, so I would also recommend Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, which is Neil Gaiman's retelling of the myths found in the Norse Edda, and he retells them just brilliantly. I love reading it and listening to the audiobook. It's rather like having Neil Gaiman tell you a bedtime story. The next opera I wanted to touch on is La Traviata by Giuseppe Verdi. It was based on the novel La Dame aux Camélias, or The Lady of the Camellias, by Alexandre Dumas Fil, which I have not yet read, but is on its way from the Strand, so I'm very excited to read it. It is the story of Violetta Valéry, who is a celebrated courtesan in Paris, and her relationship with the young Alfredo Germont. I have an entire video about La Traviata, which I will link down below, So the book that I felt best linked to this novel, apart from its original text, was The Crimson Petal and the White by Michel Faber. I loved this book, but I did also read it about 10 years ago, so just take my recommendation with a grain of salt. It is about the Victorian prostitute Sugar, with dreams of being a writer, but who, through very strategic relationships, begins to work her way up through Victorian society. This is a much darker story than La Traviata. La Traviata is tragic, but this is deep and dark. I would also recommend La Traviata if you enjoyed the film Moulin Rouge. The next set of operas I wanted to talk about is Donizetti's Tudor trilogy. He wrote 3 operas, 4 technically, but there are 3 in a trilogy at least that are very often performed together, that all take place during the Tudor reign. The first is Anna Bolena, the second is Maria Stuarda, and the third is Roberto Devereux, referring of course to Robert Dudley's son, the Earl of Essex. There is a 4th, Il Castello di Kenilworth, but that is less performed as far as I know. To go along with any of those operas, I would recommend reading the actual Tudor history that goes along with it, as Donizetti tended to add characters or reimagine events for dramatic effect. And the 2 that I would most recommend are The 6 Wives of Henry VIII by Antonia Fraser. This is an excellent comprehensive guide to Henry VIII's reign, his 6 marriages, and the impact that all of them had not only on his reign, but on future reigns. I would also recommend Elizabeth and Mary, Cousins, Rivals, Queens by Jane Donne, which is a dual biography of Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. I have not read this, but it does come highly recommended by my mother, who is a connoisseur of all things Tudor. The next opera that I would highly recommend is Agrippina by George Friedrich Handel, which follows the life of Agrippina the Younger, who was one of the Emperor Claudius's wives, and her machinations to try and get her son Nero made emperor. It is darkly funny and just absolutely wonderful. I would highly recommend the production starring Joyce DiDonato. To go along with Agrippina, I would recommend the Claudius series, so both I, Claudius and Claudius the God by Robert Graves. These books are a fictional autobiography of the Emperor Claudius, which covers every emperor from Caesar Augustus all the way through to the end of Claudius's life. So Agrippina and Nero do not show up until Claudius the God, but you do rather need to read I, Claudius first to understand who many of the characters are that he references. Again, no opera video would be complete without mentioning La Bohème by Giacomo Puccini, which is the story of young artists living in Paris and the ill-fated love of Rodolfo and Mimi. It is the classic Victorian love story of starving artists and women with consumption. It is long, it is deeply famous, but it is also deeply moving if done well. To go along with La Bohème, I have chosen The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeill, which also takes place in the Victorian era, and it follows young artists who are very much modeled on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, so such artists as Rossetti and Millais, and it particularly follows a young woman who falls in with all of them. But it takes a twist in that the love story becomes an obsessive stalker love story. It gets much darker than La Bohème does, but is extremely compelling. I read this, I believe, in one day. I was traveling, but I read it straight through in one day. It was so masterfully done. Bonus, if you enjoyed the musical Rent, you would be well prepared to see La Bohème, which is its original and its inspiration. The next opera that I want to talk about is a lesser-known one, which is Les Contes Ory by Gioacchino Rossini, which is a bel canto opera about Le Comte Ory, or Count Ory, who is a notorious playboy, and his attempts to try and seduce every woman in the town, but particularly a local countess whose husband has gone off to the Crusades along with all the other men in the town. And I did not know what to expect from this opera, but it is deeply funny. The amount of disguises that Count Ory adopts are so ridiculous, and there is a beautiful moment, at least in the production I saw, of the most wonderful play on sexuality that I have ever seen. It's the most wonderful trio, musically, and the way they choreographed it was just brilliant. But it does rather take you by surprise. It's very tongue-in-cheek and just a delight. So to go along with this, I would recommend the book The Vesuvius Club by Mark Gatiss. Yes, Mark Gatiss of Sherlock fame. He wrote a series of novels, of which this is the first, following the detective Lucifer Box, who begins life here as a Victorian or Edwardian gentleman, I'm not exactly sure which side of the 20th century they're in, who feels very much like Oscar Wilde. He's got that level of wit and tongue-in-cheek. And again, they play with sexuality here right from the off, which took me, again, very much by surprise, but in the best possible way. They're both pure romps. And the last book to opera recommendation that I came up with begins with the opera La Fanciulla del West, or The Girl of the Golden West, by Giacomo Puccini, which is the story of Minnie, a young girl in the Wild West who owns a saloon and is really the only feminine, motherly, civilizing figure in this town. All the men are there to take advantage of the California gold rush and are having varying levels of success. And Minnie is doing quite well for herself, holding her own, until the outlaw Dick Johnson rides in and needs her protection from the local sheriff. They begin to fall in love, but the sheriff has also had his eye on Minnie for ages, and the climax of the piece comes when she has to win Dick Johnson's life from the sheriff in a poker game. I didn't think I would love this opera as much as I did. It is a true delight. To go along with this opera, I have chosen the book The Glove Maker by Anne Weisgarber, which is about a young wife living in the Utah Territory who is waiting for her husband to come home one winter. He has been off selling wagon wheels to the south, and he is late. He should have been home by now, but he hasn't arrived. There are no letters, so she is very worried. And in the middle of a snowstorm, a man shows up on her doorstep, needing her to shield him from the lawmen who are following him, and her panic at trying to conceal this outlaw somewhere in this town without either of them getting caught at it. So I picked these two purely because they are both Western thrillers. So if you're in the mood for a little bit of a Western, go for either of these pieces. Of course, as you may have guessed, there are many other operas that are already based on literature that you can dive into. One of my favorites is Les Contes d'Hoffmann, or The Tales of Hoffmann, which are based on the short stories of E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote the original short story for The Nutcracker, among others. There is also Lucia di Lammermoor by Donizetti, which is based on The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. There is also Werther by Jules Massenet, which is based on The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. Eugene Onegin by Tchaikovsky, which is based on the epic poem Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin. The recent opera Marnie by Nico Muhly was based on the thriller novel by Winston Graham, and which was also turned into a Hitchcock film. And there are many Shakespearean operas, such as Hamlet, Amboise Thomas, The Tempest by Thomas Adès, A Midsummer Night's Dream by Benjamin Britten, Romeo et Juliette by Charles Gounod, and I Capuletti e i Montecchi by Bellini. Also Beatrice et Benedict by Berlioz, a takeoff on Much Ado About Nothing. And Verdi's Shakespearean trilogy of Macbeth, Falstaff, and Othello. So I hope you got at least a recommendation from my descriptions here. Let me know in the comments down below if any of these sound interesting. Have you read any of these books or heard any of these operas, such that you would agree or disagree with any of my recommendations? Would you add others? Let me know in the comments down below, and until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.